On the third night of the storm, the river had stopped being a river. It had become a surface, a flat, white, wind-scoured surface that bore no relationship to the moving water beneath it, except the faint groaning that ice makes when it is under pressure, and that the man inside the shelter could hear between the wind gusts as a reminder that the world he was inside was not the world outside. The world outside was a blizzard at 17 below zero. The world inside the shelter was 43 degrees and firelit and smelling of cured meat and pine resin, and the specific warmth of a space that has been built with attention to what winter requires rather than what a comfortable season allows a person to overlook. Owen Marsh sat with his back against the inner wall of the dome, the wall that was not his construction but the Beaver Dam's construction, the interlocked mass of alder branches and willow cuttings and river mud, packed and frozen into a thermal mass that the river's largest colony had been building and maintaining since before Owen had been born. And he noted in the small ledger he kept in his coat pocket the temperature, the fuel consumption for the day, and the wind direction from the sound of it above the structure. Northeast, sustained. The third night's wind was from the northeast. His dog, a large rust-colored animal named Sable, was asleep on the folded canvas that served as the shelter's floor covering, in the specific position of a dog that has assessed the situation and found it adequate and has made the appropriate adjustment to its expectations. Owen noted the dog's position in the ledger as well. Not from sentiment, because Sable's thermal comfort was a reliable secondary thermometer that he had been using for 6 years, and that he trusted with the confidence of a person who has verified the instrument against independent measurement enough times to no longer require the verification. If Sable was sleeping flat rather than curled, the shelter was warm enough. Sable was sleeping flat. The blizzard pressed against the outer wall of the dome, the wall of alder and willow that the Beaver colony had built at 4 feet of thickness, and that the river mud filling its gaps had frozen into a material as close to solid stone as any naturally occurring wall Owen had encountered in 20 years of living in cold country. The wall did not move. It had not moved when the Beaver colony built it, which was before the river had any record of the event. It was not going to move for a blizzard. This is not where this story begins. Owen Marsh had been trapping the Coldwater drainage for 11 years. He was 43 years old, a man of the kind that river country produces in the people who stay in it long enough, lean, observant, economical with both movement and speech, carrying the specific knowledge of a landscape that accumulates only through sustained presence and repeated testing. He knew the drainage the way a person knows a thing they have navigated in every season and in every weather condition, and that has, across those navigations, revealed itself in the specific detail that only time produces. He knew the Beaver colony on the lower reach of the North Branch. He had known it for 11 years, the lodge at the east bank, the primary dam, the secondary dam upstream, the food cache visible in the shallows in October when the colony was finishing its winter preparation. He had trapped around it rather than on it for the same reason that a man with good judgment leaves productive systems undisturbed. The colony was stable, the habitat it managed was beneficial to the larger watershed, and the particular understanding he had developed over 11 years of trapping, this drainage, told him that stable, well-managed habitat was worth more than the pelts the colony would have produced. He had never considered it as shelter. That consideration arrived in the first week of November when Sable led him to it. Not to the dam itself. He knew the dam. Sable led him to the specific section of the dam's downstream face where the colony's most recent autumn construction had extended the structure's eastern section into a configuration that Owen, standing on the frozen bank looking at it with the quality of attention that 11 years of reading this landscape had produced, had not seen before. The extension had created a cavity. Not a large cavity, not the grand chamber of the primary lodge, which the colony used and which he would not disturb. A secondary space at the dam's base, partially enclosed by the autumn construction, large enough for a man and a dog to occupy if someone was willing to do the finishing work that turned a structural coincidence into a usable space. Owen stood at the bank for a long time. Sable sat beside him and looked at the same section of the dam with the same quality of attention. Owen pressed his hand against the outer wall of the dam's eastern extension. 4 inches below the frozen mud surface, the material was not frozen. The river mud inside the dam's mass, insulated from the surface cold by the outer layer of frozen material and by the interlocked branch structure that trapped still air throughout its depth, was at the temperature of the earth itself, the deep, stable temperature of ground that the season's cold had not reached. He noted this in the ledger. East extension, cavity confirmed, wall temperature well above freezing at 4-inch depth, natural insulation mass, substantial, assess for shelter potential. He was not planning to need a shelter. He was planning to have one available. The blizzard his 20 years of reading this river had been telling him was coming was not yet visible. But it was the kind of not yet visible that a person who reads Cold Country correctly learns to distinguish from the kind that does not arrive. He began the following morning. He worked the cavity with the tools available and the time he had. Not dramatic tools, the hand axe, the draw knife, the folding spade, and the particular accumulated knowledge of what a space requires to retain heat and what it requires to exhaust smoke, and what it requires to allow a person to enter and exit without destroying the thermal environment the entry and exit interrupt. The cavity's existing dimensions were insufficient. Not in height, the dam's autumn extension had created a space of adequate height at its center point, just under 5 feet, enough to sit and move without crouching if the sitting and moving were done with the awareness of the ceiling. In width, it was adequate. In depth, it was not too shallow to allow the fire platform to be positioned far enough from the entrance that the entrance's opening and closing did not interrupt the fire's draft. He extended the depth by 18 inches. Cutting into the dam's interior mass, with the hand axe at the angle that maintained the structural integrity of the surrounding material, while creating the additional floor space the platform required. The material he removed was not wasted. It was packed into the gaps at the cavity's upper walls, where the branch structure left openings that the river mud had not fully sealed, and that the cold would find if they were not addressed. He packed them with a mixture of the excavated material and the cattail fluff from the marsh above the dam, the same natural insulator that any person who had spent time in Cold Country had learned to carry for exactly this kind of application. The entrance required the most development. An entrance to a winter shelter is not a door in the conventional sense. It is a thermal airlock, a passage that manages the transition between the exterior temperature and the interior temperature without allowing the exterior temperature to enter the interior space directly. He built it as a short tunnel, 3 feet of horizontal passage, lined with the alder branches he cut from the dam's non-structural sections, draped at both ends with the heavy canvas he carried as pack material, and that was, in this application, serving the purpose for which his experience told him canvas at a shelter entrance was most valuable. The fire platform he built from the flat stones he collected from the frozen riverbed, stones that had been in the river long enough to have had their moisture driven out by the freeze, and that would not crack under heat the way green stone could. The smoke draw was the problem. He spent 2 days on the smoke draw, the passage through the dam's upper structure that would carry the combustion products out of the shelter, without creating the cold draft that a direct chimney opening to the outside air produced in conventional construction. He solved it with the offset approach he had seen in a Mateys winter camp on the upper Assiniboine 12 years before. The passage angled through the dam's material, rather than running straight through it. the angle creating enough resistance to prevent the outside cold from funneling directly down into the fire space, while still maintaining the draft that combustion required. The first test fire failed. The smoke banked against the ceiling before finding the passage. He adjusted the passage angle by 15 degrees and cut a secondary vent at the shelter's lower front face, below the entrance tunnel, creating the pressure differential that pulled the smoke toward the primary passage rather than allowing it to spread. The second test fire worked. He noted the adjustment in the ledger and the specific geometry of the working configuration, so that if the vent required clearing after heavy snow accumulation, he would know what he was restoring. A weakness should not be allowed to hide behind success. He checked every joint and gap in the structure over the following week, pressing his hand against each surface at the end of the day to feel for the cold infiltration that a well-built shelter should not have. He found, too, a gap at the northeastern joint, where the original dam structure met his extension, and a section of the ceiling where the branch density was insufficient to prevent cold from working through. He addressed both before the first serious cold arrived. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The first serious cold arrived on the 14th of November. Not blizzard cold. 14 below zero is serious cold without being a blizzard, the kind of cold that arrives without wind and settles, and makes its presence felt through the night in the behavior of every uninsulated surface it touches. Owen spent the night in the shelter. He built the fire at the platform's lowest sustainable rate, the rate that produced heat without the consumption that a shelter heated at this rate did not require. He noted the fire at the first hour and the temperature at the first hour and Sable's position at the first hour. 41 degrees. 14 below outside. 55 degrees of differential from a fire he had built at the minimum sustainable rate. He noted this in the ledger with the specific attention that a person gives to a number that has exceeded what they calculated. Nav 14, interior 41 degrees F, exterior est, degrees F, differential 55 degrees, fire at minimum rate, dam wall performing above projection. Smoke draw clear, Sable sleeping flat. He also noted one minor problem. The secondary vent at the lower front face, the vent he had cut to create the pressure differential that pulled smoke toward the primary passage, was producing a small cold draft at floor level during the wind-still periods when the differential that drove the draft was reduced. The draft was small. It was not nothing. The cold spoke first, even when it spoke quietly. He fitted a hinged cover to the secondary vent, a piece of the canvas edge cut to size and weighted at the bottom, so that it hung closed when no fire was burning and opened under the pressure differential when the fire was active. He tested the modification the following night. The floor draft was gone. The smoke draw was unchanged. He noted the correction. Secondary vent, hinged cover fitted and confirmed, floor draft eliminated, system complete. He spent 3 more nights in the shelter through November, each one confirming the performance the 14th had established. The consistency was the data, not the single good night but the repeated good night, which was the difference between a result and a system. Facts would speak before opinions ever could. The facts were in the ledger. The blizzard had not yet arrived to ask the question the facts were answering. He read the storm in the first week of December. Not in the sky alone, in the river. In the way the ice was forming on the Coldwater's north branch, faster and at different rates than the previous 2 seasons, which told him the air temperature above the ice was colder than November had been at equivalent dates, and that the colder air was not a temporary excursion, but a sustained condition building toward something. He also read it in the Beaver colony. The colony had been moving with unusual intensity through October and into November, the food cache building faster than he had observed in previous years, the dam maintenance continuing later into the season, the specific behavior of animals that have read their environment with the accuracy that survival calibrates, and have understood something about the winter ahead that a human observer reads with more difficulty. He trusted the colony's reading. He began the final preparation on the 7th of December. The shelter's fuel supply doubled. He carried birch and dry alder from the cache he had built above the flood line and stacked it in the entrance tunnel, and in the alcove he had cut at the shelter's rear wall specifically for this purpose. Enough fuel for 14 days at the minimum fire rate, because his estimate of the coming storm's duration was 7 days, and the correct margin for a 7-day estimate was 100%. The cured meat supply, sufficient for 20 days. He had been curing through October, not the commercial cure, not the elaborate preparations that a settlement smokehouse produced, but the cold cure method that a man who traps alone in cold country develops out of the specific necessity of keeping protein available without refrigeration. The thin-sliced cuts, hung in the cold, dry air of a north-facing rock ledge above the dam, salted and wind-dried until the moisture was out and the protein was stable. He hung the supply from the shelter's ceiling hooks, the alder branch pegs he had set into the dam's interior structure in October, 4 of them, strong enough to carry the hanging meat through the storm's duration. He made his final check on the 10th of December. Wall gaps all sealed. Smoke draw clear. Entrance tunnel intact. Secondary vent cover operating correctly. Fuel stacked. Meat hung. Sable present. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The storm arrived on the 12th. The blizzard came from the northeast. This was the direction his reading of the storm's signature had predicted, and the direction the Beaver colony's behavior had suggested, and the alignment of prediction and arrival was not satisfaction. It was information, and the information was that the system he had prepared was now being tested by the event it was prepared for. He built the first storm night fire at the minimum rate. Interior temperature at the first hour, 40 degrees. Exterior temperature, estimated from the behavior of the moisture on his breath inside the entrance tunnel during the 30 seconds it took to check the outer vent cover, below 0. He estimated 15 below. 55 degrees of differential. The same differential the 14th of November had produced. He noted this without surprise. The system had been performing consistently, and consistent systems produce consistent results when the conditions are within the range they were designed for. The question was whether this storm was within the range. Day 1 answered yes. Day 2 brought the wind. The wind from the northeast arrived on the morning of the second day with the specific sustained force of a blizzard that has organized itself fully and is now delivering what it assembled, not gusts, which a structure can manage with the resilience of a material that bends and recovers, but sustained wall pressure, which a structure manages with mass. The Beaver Dam had mass. 4 feet of interlocked alder and willow and frozen river mud, built by a colony that understood the relationship between mass and water management, and had been applying that understanding to this specific section of the Coldwater's North Branch for longer than Owen had been alive. The wall did not move. The interior temperature on the morning of day 2, 41 degrees. 1 degree warmer than the night before, because the sustained wind pressure against the outer face was compressing the dam's mass into a configuration that slightly increased its insulating efficiency, which was not something Owen had calculated, and was not something he could explain beyond the observation that it was happening. He noted it. Day 2, interior 41 degrees F, wind sustained NE, dam wall no movement, smoke draw clear, Sable flat. Day 3 brought the hardest cold. Not the hardest wind that had been day 2. The hardest cold arrived on the 3rd morning in the still air that follows a wind shift, when the blizzard's leading edge had passed, and the temperature behind it had fallen to the level that the storm's center had been carrying, and that was now in direct contact with every surface it could reach. Owen estimated the exterior temperature on the morning of day 3 at 22 below. Interior temperature, 39 degrees. He built the fire at the sustained rate rather than the minimum rate, not emergency, not panic, but the calibrated increase that a system designed for flexibility allows when the conditions have reached the edge of the design range, and the correct response is deliberate adjustment rather than improvisation. The interior temperature by mid-morning, 48 degrees. He noted the adjustment and its result. He also noted Sable, who had remained sleeping flat through all 3 nights. Morning is enough. The blizzard held for 3 more days at varying intensity before releasing its grip on the Coldwater drainage on the evening of the 6th day. Not dramatically, not with a visible lifting, but with the gradual reduction in sustained force that signals a storm's completion the way a tide's turning signals the sea's decision to change direction. On the morning of the 7th day, Owen lifted the entrance canvas and looked at the river. The river was a surface, a flat, white, wind-scoured surface with the faint groaning of ice under pressure. He was back where the story began. And he was warm. He stayed in the shelter through the 7th day. Not because the storm required it. The storm had released on the 6th evening, and the 7th morning was quiet. He stayed because the 7th day was the correct day to stay. The day when the conditions outside were not what they had been on the 6th, but were not yet what they would be on the 8th. And a person who has been managing a specific environment for 6 days has a detailed understanding of that environment and a less detailed understanding of the one outside it. He used the 7th day to complete the ledger. Not just the blizzard entries, those were complete. The structural assessment entries that a shelter of this type required after a sustained weather event. Every wall joint pressed by hand for movement or gap development, every vent checked for obstruction, every ceiling hook tested for load integrity, the entrance tunnel walked for settling. Nothing required correction. The dam had not moved. He noted this in the final entry with the specific brevity. He brought to conclusions that had been established through data rather than assertion. Day 7 post-storm assessment, no structural movement, all gaps intact, smoke draw clear, vents operational, ceiling hooks sound, system intact, winter showed none. He emerged on the morning of the 8th day. The shelter's exterior was a snow-covered dome against the downstream face of the Beaver Dam, indistinguishable, at the distance the river's width provided, from the dam's own winter profile. The only indication of human occupation was the faint smoke from the primary vent, rising in the still post-storm air in the thin, steady column of a fire managed correctly rather than urgently. He stood on the river ice and looked at it for a moment. Sable stood beside him. A man named Thomas Greer, who ran the nearest trapping operation on the Coldwater's southern branch, and who had been weathering the same blizzard in the conventional canvas tent camp that was the standard winter accommodation for independent trappers in that drainage, reached Owen's position on the 10th day, 4 days after the storm's end, delayed by the post-storm conditions that a tent camp in a blizzard produces. Thomas had the specific quality of a man who has come through something difficult and is now encountering a man who has come through the same thing differently, and who is not yet certain which of those 2 experiences deserves more credit. He looked at the shelter. He asked what it was. Owen showed him the ledger, the November test entries, the system modifications, the blizzard temperature logs, the final structural assessment. He showed him the entrance tunnel construction and the smoke draw offset and the secondary vent cover and the ceiling hooks and the stone fire platform. He showed Thomas everything. He was not a withholding man. The knowledge had not become more valuable by being kept. A drainage this cold, this far from the nearest supply point, with winters this capable of producing what the past 7 days had produced, was a drainage in which every person's survival was improved by the knowledge being shared rather than held. Thomas asked about the beaver colony. Owen was clear. The colony was not disturbed. The shelter used the dam's external structure and a secondary cavity that the colony's own construction had created. The colony was intact. The lodge was untouched. The food cache was untouched. The arrangement was with the dam, not with the animals, and the arrangement required only that the dam's structural integrity be maintained, which Owen's presence had, if anything, improved through the gap filling and joint sealing he had done in October. Thomas looked at the dome. He said he had never seen anything like it. Owen said he had not either. He said it still needed fixing. Not the structure was sound. The smoke draw's offset angle had produced a minor creosote accumulation in the passage's upper section that a month of use had revealed and that a spring cleaning would address. It still needed fixing. Not because it had failed. Because a weakness should not be allowed to hide behind success. He was, for the first time in 11 years of working the Coldwater drainage in every condition the drainage could produce, exactly where his knowledge and his observation and his willingness to build what the situation required rather than what convention provided had placed him. Not comfortable. A man who has spent 6 days in a beaver dam in a blizzard below zero has earned the right to not call the outcome comfortable. But alive, warm, with a ledger full of what worked and what needed fixing and what the following winter would be able to use. Facts would speak before opinions ever could. The facts were in the ledger. The beaver dam was still standing. Sable was already walking back toward the entrance, which was the final and most reliable piece of data available.